So here I am in Visual Studio about to create a new project. Normally I don't show you this step because you already know how to do it, but for this video we need to start here because it's important to take a close look at what directory our projects are being stored in. When you create a project in Visual Studio, you have the option to choose where you'd like to save your project. This same directory is going to be where we're going to create our text file because that's where the Visual Studio compiler is going to go by default to look for it. Now we can see here that my project is being stored on the C drive under users, Delta, source, repos. A path similar to this is Visual Studio's go-to, so yours might be just like that. But if you're saving it somewhere else, that's totally fine, but we just need to know where we're saving that project. Now, to navigate to where that location is on your computer, you can just pull up your File Explorer, and then we're just going to follow it. So we're going to start out here with the C drive, and then users, and C Delta. Here I'm just following it along. Source, and then repos. All right. Now, my project files video example is not here yet, but as soon as I hit create, boom, there it is, right there, okay? Now, if we navigate into this directory, we can see here that we've got our solution and our Visual Studios, peripheral files. This is exactly where we're going to create our text file. So now that we're here, I'm just going to right click with my mouse and go New, Text Document. And I'm going to name it clients.txt. And press enter. All right, now with our file created, we can open it and we can add in our data. Now just a note here, this process that we're doing right now is for our ifstream file objects because ifstream is going to read in from this data file. As I mentioned earlier, if we were declaring an ofstream file object and this file did not already exist here, the ofstream object would create it. It's the same location as we're doing now because that's the default save place. If you want to store your file somewhere else or access a file in another location, you can definitely do that. You just need to include the directory path as part of your parameter for your file object. To add data to our file, I'm just going to open it and we're just going to type directly in here. Now remember that left to right is columns and up and down is rows. Now let's save this to commit our data. All right, so we'll just file, save, and then I'm going to close this and reopen it. I want to show you this because I want to point out that my cursor is hanging out over here in the top left. Why? Because that's the natural starting place, since in English we read left to right and top to bottom. As luck would have it, our program is going to be reading in the same location. So my cursor is starting here in the top left because that is where it too is going to start to read. So when we start reading all of this data into our program, June is going to be the very first parameter that we read in. Okay, but how exactly are we going to do that though? Well, let's take a look at this file and start with what we know. We've worked with single values before, reading and writing a single value that goes with a single variable, but here we're going to need to scale that process to move through all of these values. How could we do that? Let's work through it. So we learned how to read in a value from a file, and we see that syntax here. We've got our file object reading into our variable. But this only does one variable, which means that we can only read one value. Since reading our file has many values, we need to repeat this code so that we can iterate through the whole file. Wait a minute, that's it. We're going to iterate. And what does iterating typically go hand in hand with? Loops. And loops allow us to repeat code until a certain condition is met. So for our file, what is that condition going to need to be? Well, in order to total the sales for each of our clients, we're going to need to iterate through this whole file so that we can read in all of the data. Our block of code here on the left can only handle one value, so you might think, oh, well, we just need to repeat this code 12 times using a for loop, and that will move through all the values. If you were thinking that, I like the cut of your jib. You're on the right track and good instincts, but we have two small hitches with that. One, we've got two types of data here in our file. We have strings and we have ints. Unfortunately, we don't have a single variable data type that is going to work for both of those. So that means that we're going to need at least two variables, one for strings and one for ints. Secondly, taking a count-based approach locks our program into being built for just this file. If we worked with any other file, they might not have the same number of clients. There might be more here. And unfortunately, that would break our program. Remember that we always want to design for scalability. So maybe a while loop would be better, because then we can set up a custom condition that makes sure that we read through our whole file. So how could we do that? What could that condition be? Maybe something like, if not the end of the file, then continue to run. Luckily, our fstream library that manages our file object also includes a file object function that is perfect for this. It's called the end of file function, and in order to make it not true, we're going to put an exclamation point in front of the statement. So in English, what I've got here so far is while not the end of the file object, initialize variable with the value from file object. Perfect. So the first time that this runs, file object, remember it's going to start here in the top left because that's where we would start reading, and it's going to initialize variable with the very first value, June. Then it's going to move on to the next value, 2000. So this is where we hit our first intermixed data type snag. I mentioned earlier that we're going to need at least two variables to successfully read this file in because we have two different data types, the strings and ints. Since June is the first value, our file object needs to be initializing variable as a string variable for the first time it runs. Okay, now we see that here. To begin reading in the numerical data, you might want to do something like this. The first time that this ran, it would grab Sarah for variable, and then the value of 2000 for variable 2. But the next time it ran, it would choke up by trying to insert 425 into a string variable. See the issue? It would be easy here to get crazy and just keep adding variables, variable 3, 4, 5, all the way up to compensate, but there's got to be a better solution. So instead of creating a lot of variables, let's keep it clean and repurpose the variables that we already have using a for loop. Much better. Now, in English, we have continue to read file object if it is not the end of the file. Take the value from file object and initialize it with variable. Then we move into our for loop here where we've declared I as our iterator, continue to run as long as I is less than 3, that's not a heart, and then increase the value of I by 1. So when we move within the scope of our for loop, we've got our file object, take that value and initialize it into variable 2, which is right here, and then run again, initialize it with 425, run again, initialize it with 699, and at that point, I is going to become equal to 3, and we'll move out of the scope of our for loop. Here, come back up, check our condition, and we're going to be hanging out at Paul, so it will not be the end of the file. Paul goes into variable, and then we continue through the rest, all right? Does that make sense? But if you're thinking back to the requirements for our program, we're missing some logic here that is going to accumulate this numerical data for each of our clients. So to get that going, let's pop over to Visual Studio. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio, and I've got all of our logic here from what we just saw in the PowerPoint presentation, except I've updated our placeholder objects with proper names so that we're ready to start working on accumulating the sale data for our clients. As our structure is right now, our while loop is going to ensure that we iterate through all of our rows, so that's the up and down movement, and that's going to handle our string data, and then our for loop is going to move us through all of our columns, the left and right, and that's going to handle all of our numerical data. Now, before we start building the logic to accumulate all of our client spending totals, let's go ahead and run this with a couple cout statements. I added that right here so that we can print what we're reading from the file and make sure that it looks the same. So rather than just running this, let's actually take it through with debugging mode. Again, you can just press F10, and that way we can kind of step through and see moving through our file. Okay, So as a reminder, when you're in the step through mode, you can see where you are in your program using this little yellow arrow right here. And then we're just going to press F10 to move on to the next line and go all the way through. Now, as we go through each of these lines, remember that down here in our autos window, we can see our variables. So we have hit our read file and populated our string name, and that's June, so that's perfect. That's what we are expecting. Keep on moving through, and we got our very first spending amount, 2,000. So when we execute this, that should print out for us. Okay, awesome. And here we are on the console, looking good so far. Let's keep going. All right, excellent. So now June has printed out, and that's exactly what we saw in our presentation a second ago, so that's perfect. And now here we are at read file, currently June, but when we go through our next line, okay, so now we're on Paul. So you see how our while loop is managing all of our individual customers, and then here in our for loop, okay, we're now iterating through. See, this repeats through the for loop, and that's moving us through all of our columns. And that's printing out over here just like it should be. Excellent. All right. Hey, look at that. It looks just like our file. So we're doing it right. Awesome. Okay, now we're ready to start accumulating our data. Let's go ahead and get out of debugging mode here. Okay, now where do we want to start accumulating? What part of our code is working with the numerical data? It's our nested for loop right here, right? So it seems logical that that's where we're going to need to do the accumulating. But before we do that, we need to declare an accumulator. So this will be the value that accumulates all of our clients' total spending. So let's go ahead and call it total spending. And I'm going to initialize that to 0. Now, why does that need to be initialized to 0? Well, because if we don't initialize a variable, that doesn't inherently mean that it's given the value of 0, right? So until it's initialized, it's entirely void of a value entirely. And we know from our previous errors of uninitialized variables that you can't work with a variable until it's initialized. So we always initialize accumulators and counters to 0 so that they're ready to rock and roll when we need them. Okay, where are we going to put this though? Now that we've declared it, where do we actually want to place it in our program? Okay, so looking at our for loop, this is going to take us through the columns. Now here, we're going to read that numerical value from read file and initialize spending amount with that value. So really, we can't do any accumulating until this line has executed, right? But right after it, we can start. So let's go ahead and start our accumulating here. Now, what we want to do is we want to set total spending equal to its own value plus whatever the value of spending amount is. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do that here in shorthand. So what this reads in English is total spending is equal to total spending plus the value of spending amount. All right, excellent. Now, this is going to continue to iterate through and keep adding spending amount to total spending until we get to our final loop and we bust out of here and then move on to the next client. So before we do that, to check our total spending value, let's go ahead and do a cout statement here and print it to the screen. So this will give the name of the client and their total spending. In the spirit of modular testing, before we move on, let's go ahead and step through this and check our work. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and step through this. Okay, so here we've got June, and of course we're going to print out her values. So we've got her as spending $2,000, $425, and $699, which gives us a total of $3,124. Perfect. So that's exactly what we would be expecting from adding all these numbers together. Excellent. That's a good sign. Let's keep going. Okay, now we're on to Paul. And we've got Paul as spending $1,200, $18, and $756. Okay. Oh. But now here it has his spending total as $5,098. which is not 1,974 like it should be if we added these values together. So what is going on here? Let's take a look at our code and find the issue. Okay, well, if we look down here in our autos window, we can see that total spending is showing as 5,098, which is what we're seeing in the console. And I added June's up correctly. So what's happening here that it stopped working on Paul? Where did that come from? Well, if we keep stepping through, let's take a look and see what happens next time we get to that line. Okay, so we're going to watch a little more closely. Now, okay, read file is going to execute. Okay, and that is $675, which is what we would expect to see for Jesse. Okay, now we get here. See how total spending is now 5,773? Well, how is it possible to have that value if spending amount was 675? Well, it's because by the time we got to total spending, we weren't starting at 0. We were starting at Paul's previous 5,098. And if we add 675 to that, it is indeed 5,773. So when we start a new client, we also need to restart our accumulator for that client. And so we've got to add some logic in here so that it resets to 0 before we begin accumulating for the next customer. Let's go ahead and pop out of debugging mode and add that in. So we just need to reset our total spending back to 0 before we go to our next iteration of our while loop. So I'm just going to put that right here. Okay, let's run this one more time and check our work. Awesome. Okay, here we go. So June's spending, 3,124, perfect. We've got Paul and his spending, 1,974. And then finally, Jesse with 2,483. Boom, that's exactly what we were looking for. So I'm glad we were able to kind of get ourselves into that situation in this video, because that is one more thing about working with counters and accumulators is oftentimes, especially when you're moving through records like that in a file, you will need to take that extra step of just resetting them back to 0 before you move on to the next one. It's all part of that lovely problem-solving process.